So yeah, the topic of this webinar is indeed the Information Delivery Specification. As you've all seen, it was released as a final 1.0 version by buildingSMART recently. But to be able to talk about the Information Delivery Specification, IDS, we need to talk about information, actually. What kind of information do you need, and how are you going to define the different information? So when we look at IFC, for example, you can exchange a .ifc file without actual information in it, just objects that have no meaning or semantics and geometry. This is not real information, even though it is being exchanged as a .ifc file. What we really want is information that is semantically annotated. So if you really want to understand what this geometry is, what this object with geometry is, we really need to understand the semantic richness that this is a stair flight and not just lines and geometry. So this semanticness, this richness of information is the basis for the Information Delivery Specification that we are presenting here today. So how do you do that? First, you need to know what information you actually need. And what we see a lot in practice is examples like send me an LOD 350, whatever LOD means, level of development, level of detail, level of whatever. And then 350, everyone just has to assume we know what it is. Or I want IFC, but that's just saying something about the definition of object. It's not saying what information you actually need for your project. Or I need the stairs. Okay. But in what kind of way do you want to have information about the stairs? What kind of properties and characteristics do you need? So these are considered not really good examples. They're not specific enough. They're not really going into the details of what you actually need. A better example would be, I need an information set that has at least one stair in there, and every stair must have a property called number of riser, and the value needs to be higher than 1. So this is a much more specific example of information requirements. And this is also what we see more and more in practice, luckily. There's more and more people moving away from give me IFC, just give me everything you have, or just give me an LOD 350. More and more projects we see these kind of examples where people say, I need a staircase, needs to have these properties, and values of the properties need to have a certain format as well. So how do we see this? How is this going to be exchanged? Currently in a lot of projects, obviously Excel here is the most popular one, but this is immediately where you run into problems, because this can be much more effective and much more efficient. And this is the reason why IDS is developed. The Information Delivery Specification is an XML-based format that can really specifically define these kind of requirements in a machine interpretable way. So I always make a point of making a distinction between computer interpretable and computer readable, because PDFs and Excel are also computer readable. Computer interpretable without human intervention is really what we're striving for. That's what we're aiming for, because then the computer can automatically process some tasks in a workflow that we all want to have processed quickly. So diving into the details of this specification, the XML structure of IDS forces us to put it in this way. This is already very technical. I think we're at slide number 10 and I'm 14, and I'm showing XML format. But the good thing about IDS is you don't have to type this, obviously. And this is just one way of exchanging the information. Just like nobody opens an IFC file in Notepad, nobody obviously has to open an IDS file in Notepad either. There's multiple ways to view this information in a grid, but you can also just generate text from it in a PDF. So this is important to realize. There's software that produces this IDS file. This is a computer interpretable format. And because it is computer interpretable, the computer can generate different kinds of representations from it. So this PDF, this text is actually generated from an IDS file. So this is what people usually see. So this is the representation of the same requirement I had earlier. As you see, the model must contain entities that have an IFC class stair or stair flight, and it must have a property number of riser in a pset stair common, and that has to be the property number of riser has to be of a certain data type, and the value needs to be bigger than 1. There's also instructions here, human readable instructions for someone who gets this IDS file and needs to put in this data. So this is a nice mix of computer interpretable, but supporting humans to be able to get the context. This is what we call a specification. So the specification consists of 2 parts. It's the applicability part, the filter. So you need to have something in the model. I want to have stairs. What do I mean by stair? My definition of a stair is actually the one that is 100% similar to IFC stair or IFC stair flight. So if I say stair, there needs to be a stair. What I mean is there needs to be an object in there that is either IFC stair or IFC stair flight. So this is my applicability, my filter, my definition of my human definition of a stair. I have to tell the computer what I mean by stair. That's this applicability part. And then we have the requirements part. So for the thing that I call stair, which a computer understands as IFC stair, I have requirements. And I can list multiple requirements here, just like the fact that I can also list multiple things that make up my definition here. So this specification has applicability and requirements, and this is the standard structure of every specification in an IDS. I actually created an example with more specifications. So I also said that all walls need to have a certain classification code that can be found in the BSDD. I made an example of all the stairs need to have a material that is this Portuguese term, and all beams need to have an attribute with a name, and the name needs to be this value. So these are 4 specifications that together make up an IDS file. So an IDS file is not much more than just a list of individual specifications. And these specifications all have the same structure. They have this applicability part and the requirements. Now let's add some additional information, like for what milestone do you want to have this IDS file? Who owns the copyright? What is the delivery date, etc., etc. Who created it? Some additional human readable instructions, etc. So an IDS file is actually a file. You can exchange it with .ids. When you look at it, it's an XML structure. It has this information in the header, and then it just lists all of these specifications. There's no limit to the specifications. And the nice thing about it is that you can then also just copy paste these individual specifications and create your own file by bundling the specs that you need for your project. So looking at this file that I created, as I said, I have 4 specifications. As you see, there's some human readable descriptions here, and then the computer interpretable parts in the applicability requirements. So all of the files have the same structure. It's just a list of specifications. As you see here, I have 4 specifications in this example, but you can have 30, 300, whatever you want. How did I create this file? I could have used akka. As you see here, this is the applicability part. Sorry, the requirements part. My Zoom thing was in the way. As you see, the requirements here is that the property number of risers in stair common must be greater than 1. And also this classification of the SYNAPI, also with the reference to the BSDD, where people can actually look up what this classification code means. I could have used akka as BIM, I say, because I also could have used this free tool from BIM Vision that is coming on the market, I think a couple of weeks ago. So you see the same list of specifications here, same requirements, piece head stair common, number of riser. There are actually a lot of different tools. Currently, we are aware of 21 tools that have self-declared that they are supporting IDS authoring. There is a link on our technical website. I think Aidan will be able to share that in the chat, where you can search for a filter for IDS authoring, and you will get a list of all of the tools that are supporting this. It's this link for those who can type quickly. But we already knew this, of course. We did some experiments and challenges during the summit last year in Lillestrøm, where we had a couple of these big names like CoBuilder, Planoly, BIMQ, BIM Permit, XBIM, and even the Excel sheet from Carlos Diaz worked very well on the 0.9.7. All of these, I think, have been now updated to IDS 1.0 as well. So 21 authoring tools, whatever you prefer. There's a different flavor for everyone. Yeah, just to give you a hint, I neither used Akka nor BIM Vision. I actually am one of those people that just likes to type it into Notepad, and it also works. There's a lot of tools out there that can support you with that. So we now defined these requirements. I have 4 in this example. I created an IDS file from that. So I have a .ids file, which is this XML-based format. Now, data has to be produced according to these requirements, and then that data is being shared as an IFC file. We also have an IFC file for this example. And now we want to check the IDS requirements against the IFC data. So I have 2 files. I have a .ifc file, which is this IFC file format, and I have a .ids file. Now let's do some checks. Let's validate these things. Let's check them, however you want to call it. Let's bring them together. Also for this, I could have used Akka OSBIM, which has a nice functionality that checks the IDS against the IFC. As you see here, there's a couple of errors found in this IFC file. The staircases don't have a certain property. In this case, also, all of the walls have a classification code except for these red-colored walls. And this is also where you see this link to the BSDD, where people can actually have a pop-up that directly goes to the BSDD to see what that code actually means and how they should be using it, when it was published, etc., etc. So this is already a slight hint of how IDS and BSDD work together. The requirements of a certain classification code could be unknown to a user that has to add this, but then the reference to the BSDD gives them all of the information they need. So this is Akka OSBIM as one example. I tend to use BIMWorks in demos as well, because it has a pretty nerdy interface. I prefer that. BIM Vision recently has released an IDS checker as well that has a completely different interface, much more human readable in a report style. So again, also in this situation, there are multiple different software tools that we know of that are able to perform this check. We've seen a couple again last year in Lillestrøm, the front runners, but there's quite a lot recently after the release of 1.0 that have also announced support for this. So again, here, a preference, whatever preference you have, there's a lot of different capabilities of doing this check. Most of these tools also then have the ability to export a BCF file, a BIM collaboration format, and share the results using the Documents API. But this is not what this webinar is about. So this is a very simple workflow. Someone creates requirements, exports that as an IDS, someone produces an IFC based on the requirements. The IFC is then checked against the IDS, and the results are shared as BCF. Let's dive into a little bit of a more detailed workflow, just for those who are on the webinar that are interested. I think this is the picture that started the project. So just a bit more steps, a bit more detailed. The client, whatever client it is, it can even be a contractor that acts as a client to a subcontractor. They define these requirements and create an IDS file. They can use templates for that. They can use the use case marketplace from buildingSMART, use case management system. Maybe they copy paste some of these specifications from other IDS files that they have. They can search BSDD. However way they create this, there's a lot of software tools available. Some client creates an IDS. Then the IDS file is sent to the modeler. This is this extra step. A modeler ideally has a check to verify if the software tool that they are using has the capabilities to actually provide the information that is required in the IDS. Then the modeler creates the data. Maybe they use the BSDD for further data enrichment. Some of the modeling tools that create IFC have the ability to directly link to BSDD. So if there are properties in the IDS that are required that have a reference to the BSDD, the modeling software and the modeler have an easier job because the properties can just be clicked on to be added to the model instead of having to be manually added. Internally, some of the modeling tools already internally check if all of the data in the modeling tool is complying to an IDS. So this is, again, a more advanced functionality where BIM modeling tools internally check against the IDS before they export to IFC. Then they export to IFC. If there is internally not a valid, if internally the data is not valid against the IDS, you can even have a BCF export with issues. But if everything is correct, it's being exported as IFC. Some of the software tools can even have specific IDS settings to export only the IDS requirements instead of the full model. Again, these are all very advanced usages that we see some first glimpse of, but not everyone supports this yet. Then this IFC file is sent to the client. This can be done using the Documents API, and then the client probably also validates the IFC data against the original IDS that they created. Again, also having the ability to export that to BCF again. So this is a very advanced use. Like I said, we see some glimpse here and there of different software tools that are supporting this already. I do expect that in a couple of years, this would be the default workflow because modeling tools are supporting more of these standards. So what can you ask? What are the things that IDS supports? Is it indeed just classes and properties, stairs and properties? No, it's a bit more. And I'm using a slide here from Carlos Diaz, who has put this into a nice picture. Within IDS, we have several facets, as they are called. As we saw earlier, we have multiple of these specifications. They all have an applicability and a requirements part. And the facets that are in there are entities, attributes, classification, property, material, and parts. All of these 6 facets are both in the applicability part and in the requirements part. So if you define a staircase as an IFC stair with a certain property, with a certain material, where you say, this is my stair and my definition of a stair, which you will find in IFC as an IFC stair with a property with a certain value and a certain material, then I have the requirement that it needs to be that it needs to have a certain classification or a certain attribute or part of something else. So there's a symmetry between applicability and requirements. You can put all of these facets, all of these things, both in the applicability, in the filter part, and in the requirements part. If you want to know more about this, there is a very detailed overview made by Menno Meekens, where he goes through every facet one by one, really giving examples what the capabilities are and how you can use them. The link here, you can find this video on our YouTube channel. I think Aidan is also able to share this link in the chat. And this screenshot is also from that video. It's called Zoom In on IDS. I think Benno is using BIM Collab Zoom as an example there, which is also one of the front runners on this. And he really goes into an example per facet, and he also shows how these facets can be combined in different ways with different examples. Highly recommend to watch that YouTube channel. So in short, what is in scope for IDS is objects, like entities, attributes of these objects, properties and quantities. Some of the geometry requirements are also possible in IDS, like height and width, because these are things that are separate attributes or properties in IFC. Materials, obviously, and also some relations, like assemblies, groups, these kind of things. And most importantly, or most advanced, is a combination of all of these above. So again, I can have a staircase with a certain material that has specific requirements. So all of these facets can be used both in the filtering part and in the requirements part, which makes it a very, very powerful way to define requirements. So these are some boring slides with just text. I think this is the last one, just some tips and tricks to take full advantage of IDS. If you've already tried it, if you have seen these examples in some kind of a webinar or a workshop, and want to continue this, like I said, you can combine different facets in this filter and requirements part. Please experiment with that. It's very powerful. Reuse as much existing P sets and properties from IFC as possible. Please stop making up your own properties if they're already in IFC. Use BSDD to find existing classes, properties, and materials, not just from IFC, but also from other existing strong standards. We have some powerful national standards in BSDD. Please reuse those property definitions instead of making up your own. Also, classes in the BSDD, please use these classes inside IDS, and then they will end up as classification reference in IFC. This is a much more powerful and flexible way to add further IFC specializations instead of using user-defined types, which is really not recommended. Obviously, don't put classes and types into properties. Actually use them as classes and classification reference. I know properties are much easier to put in most of modeling tools, but it's really much more powerful to do it the right way. Make these references to published classes. For example, in BSDD, this is these links from properties or classes to BSDD. Use software that integrates an IDS audit tool to make sure that your IDS is 100% valid and correct. But the most important tip of all, just start simple. IDS is very powerful with all of these different facets and combinations, but please just start very simple. We saw that 90% of the use cases is indeed just entities and properties. So please just start there and work your way up from there into these more advantageous things as well. So these are some tips and tricks. I think we're kind of giving an image here of what IDS can do. So let's also try to zoom in what it cannot do, what it is not intended to do. IDS is not intended to define design rules. So maximum distance from one space to another, or minimum distance from a sprinkler to a door, whatever kind of design requirements you have, IDS is not meant to define your design requirements. IDS is meant to define the information requirements you need to have to check your design rules. So this is a two-phased approach. If you want to check the distance between spaces, you need to have IFC spaces. If you want to check the minimum distance of a sprinkler to a door, you need to have sprinkler installations, you need to have a door, you probably need to have spaces. So IDS is made for defining the information requirements you need to have, the information you need to have to actually do your job and to perform these rules and these checks. That's also the reason why IDS does not have any dependencies. There's no if this then that kind of structure in IDS. It's not that if this space is of a certain type, then the walls connecting the space needs to have certain requirements. These are all considered design rules and are not part of IDS. Translations are also not in IDS. This is a computer-interpretable format. If you have translations of some properties, they are not intended to be put into IDS. This is where BSDD comes in. And we also don't have OR mechanisms in IDS. We've seen some examples where people say, if you have a wall, you need to put in this property or that property, one of the two. This is also going against the whole principle of IDS, where you need to be specific in defining the requirements you need. Basically saying that you need one property or the other is not specific enough. That's basically coming back to the original examples of give me an LOD 350 or just give me walls. You need to make up your mind. You need to be specific. You need to understand what information you need. And you need to have the courage to also make the choices to basically tell someone that that this is what you need and not giving them too many options or choices. So this is out of scope. Some more advanced usages of IDS. I can talk hours on this. I think we're actually planning an IDS advanced use webinar as well after the summer break. But just to give you some hints to what could be possible, and this is getting a little bit nerdy maybe. So in this standard process of requiring information and producing the information, we always have this BSDD as a reference to both. So how does BSDD fit into this IDS and IFC workflow? We've already seen it a little bit with these references. BSDD has a definition, has a list of many dictionaries with classes and properties and materials that you can search to be able to define your requirements. And some of the software tools that we saw to create an IDS have already implemented this system. So this is a screenshot of Akka, for example, where instead of saying that I want to have a property that I type in myself, I want to have a property by searching into the buildingSMART solution for data dictionaries. So if I search here for riser, I get a lot of ETIM classes and properties as well. And when I click on surface protection, I just randomly clicked here. As you see, all of these things in BSDD have a unique identifier. When I now say add this to my specification, I have the fifth specification that has the requirement EF000139 with a reference to the URI. So instead of typing in these ETIM requirements as properties into the IDS myself, I can just search the BSDD, find the property I need, double click on it, and that then feeds the IDS specification. This URI is also quite helpful because this provides a link to all of the additional information a user might need to understand what they need to fill in here. So if a user gets this IDS file and it says you need to fill in a property EF00139, not a lot of users might know what kind of information needs to be put in there. But this is where the URI comes in. If you then follow the URI, you end up in the BSDD page. If you do that today, it actually does not look like this page. As you see, I've screenshotted a development environment of the BSDD. This is the new graphical user interface of the BSDD that is coming probably after summer. We're currently experimenting with this. So you have a sneak preview in this webinar already on the new interface of the BSDD. It might look something like this. But this is where a user that would then end up and see that this code is indeed coming from ETIM. It's version 9. It might have a further definition and a description. It has links and relations, etc., etc. So this is how the IDS can get information from BSDD, and a user can then, from the IDS URI, get more information inside the BSDD. So these URIs connect everything. If you have a BIM modeling tool, a BIM authoring tool that produces IFC that supports this, you would also see IFC files that have that reference. So even when you get an IFC file with a certain property, you can then also follow that link to better understand how that works. And of course, there's also a link from the BSDD to those kind of tools that we saw earlier. So this URI, again, this is maybe a little bit of a nerdy part of this webinar. This is a very advanced use of IDS, but this is what connects everything. And this is also where our link data strategy comes in. Just to finish up the workflow a little bit, we've already seen the BCF and documents API flow. This is not a topic of this webinar, but I'll just mention it briefly. If we then do a check between IDS and IFC, or we just do a generic rule check in some kind of a tool, and we want to communicate things, typically the communication goes over email. Like the stair needs to be fixed, second one from the left on the third floor, the red one. There's a lot of examples where Outlook is being used or just email is being used, but obviously, just like Excel, this is asking for troubles, specifically with a description like this. So this is where the BIM collaboration format comes into the workflow, where you can actually select the staircase you want to talk about, even have the camera view on how to best look at that staircase to be able to view your issue. You can assign it to someone. It has a history, comments. You can have a description of what you want, and then you exchange all of that information, again, in a computer-interpretable way as an XML format or through an API with other users. And the structure of BCF is pretty similar. It's a list of topics, just like IDS is a list of specification. This is a list of topics that you can exchange and assign with others as well. So that's where BCF comes into the flow. And then the final step, delivering this. Again, this is an IDS webinar. We're drifting away quite a bit, but this openCDE group has been working on a documents API where you then can very easily deliver the IFC, the IDS, and the BCF topics. So this is the complete full workflow. I think there's a nice YouTube video around also that explains this full flow in detail. Again, this webinar is much more focused on just IDS, but I wanted to give you a hint on the full flow and how it all connects. So a bit of history. I think we're at 35 minutes now. Who was actually involved in the creation of the IDS standards? This project started in 2021 as a first stick in the ground, where we said this is what needs to be done. buildingSMART has a role here, and the actual kickoff of the project was, I think, in 2022. And that had Cyril Planaver as the project lead. I'm not sure if anyone is on the call that still remembers him. I see we have 500 participants on the call. I'm sure there's at least one of them in there that still remembers Cyril. This was in Corona time, and Cyril really made a point of making this a team effort. So we even did a round of everyone on the call to explain what their hobbies are. I still remember vividly a picture of Cyril on a snowboard. So this was really setting the tone, setting the trend for the rest of this project. So this was, I think, 2022, but it really set the tone for the collaborative nature of what this full IDS project was. So Cyril was instrumental for defining the scope, defining the use cases, finding existing initiatives, and really setting the ground, laying the foundation for the rest of the project. There was a first phase, user requirements, user input, scope, focus. Second phase of the project was led by Sarah and Robin, both from Queensland University. This was really focused on trying to create the first prototype, the first proof of concept, working together with software vendors. Both of them have a nice mix of user input, usability, but also software implementation. So they've been leading quite a long phase where we were working from a 0.1 version to 0.2, eventually to a 0.9 version of IDS. This was hard work, and both Sarah and Robin, together with the software vendors, have made a big leap there. And then finally, the third phase, where we had this 0.9, which is like 80% of the work in 20% of the time, as you may understand. Then we needed someone to do 80% of the rest of the time, to do the last 20% of the work, all of the nitty-gritty details, all of the fine-tuning. This phase was led by Claudio Benji. Many of you know him from the University of North Cumbria, but also of XBIM. So also a nice mix of really implementer focus, but very much focused on usability and end users as well. Claudio has, together with the community, I think I need to mention Dion Mold here as well, has been working on writing the documentation, fine-tuning the documentation, writing multiple test cases for software vendors to help them implement this consistently. So these are really the heroes of this project. It's been taking years. We had multiple phases of this work, but it was really a massive effort. As you see, we had 12 software implementations already released before we even have an official standards, 85 test cases, thousands of lines of documentation. In total, we had over 200 people involved from 34 countries, over 100 meetings in total over all of these years. It's an uncountable amount of hours that has been put into this. So all of the credits go to this whole team, but especially the leaders of these several phases: Cyril, Sarah, Robin, and Claudio. So if you tend to bump into them at a buildingSMART summit or in a call or wherever, please don't hesitate to show them your gratitude. The IDS standard that we have today would not have been possible without this team. So that's what we have up until today, the 1.0 version. How does the future look? Actually, we're already looking at IDS 1.1. There have, during the reviewing process in buildingSMART, and by the vendors and the implementation of the vendors, there's a couple of things that have popped up that might be really nice additions to 1.0. So this is perfect for 1.1, and it really doesn't have to take that long. These are minor additional functionalities that are added. Depending on the market uptake, I expect this to be released half a year or a year from now, somewhere in that timeline. And we also have an IDS audit tool that is being used by software vendors to implement in making sure the IDS that they export is valid, is 100% checked. We also want to make this tool available on the buildingSMART website relatively soon. So this is all short-term future. Longer-term future, we're thinking about doing IDS software certification for the checking tools. We do expect some kind of behavior, a consistent behavior of software tools that are checking IFC against IDS. The 85 test cases obviously help, but we also want to set up some kind of a software certification for this checking. But this is definitely longer term. So if you want to follow the developments, the more technical developments can be followed on our GitHub repository. This is also where you find the technical documentation and the use cases. We have a mirror on git.com for people that do not have access to GitHub. So this is the more technical developments. The non-technical developments and the use cases obviously can be found on our new renewed IDS page on the buildingSMART.org website. Obviously, I also highly recommend you to subscribe to the newsletter. Then you can follow all of the buildingSMART news also on the other standards and solutions. So Aiden gave me 40 minutes. I think I exactly talked for 40 minutes. I probably think it's time for questions now.
Thank you, Leon. And your video has frozen. So what we're going to try and do is just amend So I don't know if you can stop it and reshare it.
It says I cannot restart my video.
Okay, we're having a bit of video issues here. Apologies
Ah,
on that. We're going to try and fix that whilst we do Q&A. Yeah, and also just want to thank everyone for their interest and apologies. We have actually exceeded our limit on number of people. So apologies for some people that weren't able to get in and have got in later. But I think that goes to show the level of interest in this topic, as well as the number of questions we've had in the Q&A. I don't think we will get a chance to answer them all, but we will try to follow up with everybody afterwards. So thank you all very much for your questions. So I think, Leon, I've got a lot of questions here, so I'm going to try and go through them, perhaps in order of, let's see if the video is still not working. I'm going to try and go through them in order of some sort of logic. And the first one is a question here. What would be your advice? Sorry, what is the best way to start simple, from Sam Holler?
yeah, I think the best way to start simple is to look at some existing IDS files. We have a couple of existing files. Actually, the files I just showed, we also shared on Box. I think we have a link somewhere that probably can also be shared. Um, there's a couple of pretty simple webinars out there, simple IDS files. Most of these IDS authoring tools that I showed are freely available. So the Arca one and the BIM Vision one. So you can just start there, click through them, just try to make up something in your mind. What do I need? What are the requirements? There's a lot of free tools available. I would just start by actually using those tools and trying a simple one or two specifications. Really try it out simple. Yeah, every time when someone asks me what is the best way to start, it's the best way to start is actually to just start. Just try it, do it. There's a lot of tutorials out there. There's free software. That's really the best way to get your hands dirty.
Thank you. Yeah, and I can confirm I've even created an IDS, so the ability to be able to do that is definitely there for everyone, and it's certainly something we recommend. Okay, we might have fixed the video issue
Videos.
with the higher. Another question here: is there any specific IDS converter or template in Excel which is supported by buildingSMART to create IDS files?
Not buildingSMART supported. So when you look at our website, the technical website under the software resources, there's a whole list of tools that have self-declared that they support this. One of the tools is the one from Carlos Diaz from Brazil, who indeed made an Excel template that you can upload to a website and it then creates an IDS. So there's a multitude of tools that you can use, and one of them is indeed an Excel sheet that Carlos made. I think it's freely available. Yeah, so this is not an official buildingSMART tool, but highly recommend to try.
Okay, question here from Hamza. Let's suppose the client creates the IDS. How would the modeler, let's say using something like Revit, deliver the required specifications?
Yeah, that depends a little bit on the BIM authoring tool that you use. I'm not sure how the latest version of Revit supports this, but there are tools that allow you to import the IDS inside your authoring tool, and then as soon as you start modeling and creating the data, the walls, the stairs, it kind of constantly checks in the background if you have all of the required information. It gives you a panel on the right side to help remind you of what you still need to do. And then if everything's green, you export to IFC and you share it. And other tools, indeed, you read it into a text interpreter and you manually add all of the things to your authoring tool, then export to IFC. You can run an internal check with your own checking software as well before you send it to the client. So it really depends on how your authoring tool supports IDS or not. I think also what I showed in the more advanced workflow use case, some of these tools now internally already support this IDS check, some not yet, but we do expect this to come pretty quickly.
And I see Guilherme has put the link from the Carlos Diaz IDS converter. So lots of kudos to
Good.
Carlos Diaz. It was nice to meet you as well, Carlos, a couple of weeks back. So great stuff you're doing there in Brazil. Another question here is, how does the audit tool work within IDS? Which I think is a great question because it's actually something I asked you as well, Leon.
Yeah. So the IDS audit tool is not meant for end users, just to be clear on that. That's also why I hardly mentioned it in this webinar. So if you create an IDS, of course, the IDS file has to comply to the IDS standard. It has to be the correct structure of XML. But there's more that you have to comply with. I mean, if you require an IFC stair with a property from PSAT wall common, that's not a good requirement. You can't require wall properties on a stair. That doesn't make sense. So there's a lot of these things in there. There's implementers agreements. There's best practices. All of those are being have been put into an IDS audit tool. So if you have an IDS file, you can audit that IDS file to see if it is actually a valid IDS, and it checks against the schema, checks against these implementers agreements, information consistency, etc. So the reason we made that audit tool, so this is an official BuildingSMART audit tool. It's also created by Claudio from XBIM, but it's an official BuildingSMART tool. It's made for the authors, the software tools that author an IDS. So Akka, for example, that I showed, is internally using this audit tool to make sure that you can only export a valid IDS. They're making all of these checks internally before you export to an IDS. So this is the intended use of the audit tool for software tools that help you create an IDS to make sure that that IDS is 100% correct before export. Yes, we also want to make this audit tool available for end users where they can upload an IDS and see if it is indeed correct, but it is intended to be used by software tools to make sure that the IDS files that are being exported are 100% correct.
Yeah, and I think this maybe leads into the next question I have here. Is there a tutorial or some suggestions on how to use IDS in combination with BSDD using existing dictionaries? And I think maybe one thing I will share on here is that the new web page for the BSDD is a good place for you to search directly for terms that you might want to create within your IDS. So I'll share that. But Leon, do you have a sort of answer for that connection between IDS and BSDD?
Yeah, I think the easiest answer there is also to use software tools that support that connection. I already showed the screenshot from Arcada where you can search the BSD, just double click and it ends up in your IDS. There's a couple of those tools more available. And otherwise, it's just searching the BSD and copy pasting the codes and the URIs. There are some tutorials available. I think when you search on them from Google is probably the first hit. But like I said earlier, I think we're also planning a more advanced IDS usage webinar after summer. So yeah, keep your eyes on that as well, I would say.
Thank you. I have a question here. Jakob's been very patient with this one, so let me see if I can do this. So if, for example, I have a staircase that I make IFC stair and predefined type spiral staircase, how important is it that the underlying components, for example, the step, center tube, attachment, have their own IFC classes and predefined types? If it is under the IFC stair element, is there any scenario it is important to define everything?
Well, the answer to that question lies, of course, with the client. If the client thinks it's really important that the information is being provided like that, then it is important. If it's less important and you just need to know some properties, then that's the case. So the only answer that I can give is that IDS does allow you with this part of facet to make these requirements. We do not see that a lot in practice. So most use cases in practice are mainly requiring properties and classifications and some types. But if you really need a stair to be decomposed in a certain way, IDS allows you to require that.
Another question here from Brian. How mature is the BSDD in relation to road and rail IFC classes?
I'm not sure I understand the question. So IFC 4.3 is published using the BSDD. So the maturity of the road and rail classes of IFC is stable. I would say it's an ISO standard. So BSDD is just a publication of existing standards. In a situation where it's publishing the classes of IFC, I would say it's pretty mature since this is also a final standard and approved by ISO.
A few questions here about how IDS relates to EN ISO 7816, which is the level of information need.
I actually did anticipate. I have a couple of slides I prepared. We have time for this.
Thanks, Stepanka, for that question.
So let me see if I can share again. So see, after my slide 75 questions, I have the slide. How does it compare to other standards? So I think this is where I'd like to give a fuller overview. So not just a SAN standard, but more of these standards. So there's a lot of these different use cases, requirements that we see. So examples like all objects must have a name, all objects must have a classification. I'm gonna do it like this because it seems to be having some animation in there that I wasn't anticipating. So there's a lot of these different requirements, and all of these we can put into an IDM. So this is already the first abbreviation. Information Delivery Manual is something where you can basically put everything in because it's just human readable text. So whatever you want to require, put it into an IDM. IDS is mainly focusing on this part. So these kind of examples are all possible in IDS. You need to use a certain dictionary. It must have an alignment curve, a certain height or width, properties, etc. But requirements like follow this process map, or the beams need to have a certain certificate, or even geometry must be BREP, or the level of geometry must have a specific detailness. Those are not possible and out of scope for IDS. Then moving on to PDTs, which is also a question we often get. I think PDTs are a slightly smaller subset of what IDS can do, with the exception of this one. So all columns need to have a value of a property that is measured according to a certain norm. This is only possible in IDS when you combine it with BSDD, and that means these kind of requirements are only possible when that property is actually also published inside the BSDD. So then next one is MVD XML for those who are interested in that. This includes this requirement that geometry needs to be of a certain geometry type, but it does leave out things like a dictionary, for example. Then the LOIN, the level of information need, is indeed also leaving out specifics like a dictionary or I think even a geometry. So the last thing I saw from the level of information need was still in draft, so not sure how it evolved. This does include the definition of this level of geometry, the detailness of geometry. But what's important to note is that this cannot be computer interpretable. So focusing on what is possible machine interpretable is really this part. And yeah, as you see, not a surprise, this is also what IDS is focusing on. There's a bit of a discussion here on geometry types, and there's probably also discussion on dictionaries. But this is the relationship between all of these different standards. I know it's messy, but I think it does show that there's different aspects that are being considered. I'm happy to share these slides as well, by the way.
Thank you. And I think you may have even answered that question there, but there's been quite a few questions about the fact that does IDS check geometric patterns and clash detection and things? And if not, is there a plan in the future to add this functionality to IDS? But maybe this.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think I mentioned it in the webinar as well. IDS is not for these kind of design checks. So clash detection is just not in scope. There are software tools that do that. Um, IDS is really intended to define the requirements of the information that you need to then perform these checks. So if you want to do a clash detection on geometry, you have an IDS that says all of the objects need to have geometry, and then you use a software tool to actually do the clash detection on that geometry. So IDS is intended to provide you with the information that you need to perform the design checks for your project.
Been a few questions as well about support and training for IDS. One thing I'd mention is we're developing some course material, body of knowledge around practitioner, which would include the IDS development and developing your own IDS. The other thing is that our summits now are a good place to come and learn how to do that. So in Marrakesh, between October 1st and 3rd, we will have an area where you can come and create an IDS within the event. So this is a good opportunity for you to come and meet with the buildingSMART team and the bigger community around buildingSMART to actually support the development of these things. So hopefully you could consider that. We've got 2 minutes left, and I had a couple of questions I did want to get to because these are less technical, more around the definition of requirements. So this is an anonymous attendee. I'll just highlight this question. Are you finding clients are providing exact information requirements and are willing to pay for them to be delivered? Or are you finding it is worth the extra cost in time defining these and checking these to be delivered than the usual traditional way of defining information? So from our perspective, are we seeing that there's a transition for clients in the investment needed for this definition?
Yeah, we are seeing a lot of clients, big and small, that are using IDS to specify the requirements. And what we also see is that they are spending less money on a project now because it's more clear for everyone what is required, and you have less of these iterations and discussions of what is actually needed and if it's good enough. So we're seeing proof now that using IDS actually makes a project cheaper because it's much more clear for every organization involved what needs to be delivered.
Thank you. And maybe I'm sorry we didn't get, there was still another 50 questions unanswered. I apologize. We will try to follow up with those, but maybe one final question as we're all out of time. Leon, in your time involved in buildingSMART, which is many years, what's your thought around how exciting this is as a standard and the uptake and the energy around it? Just was interested on your personal view more than anything.
You should never ask a question like that in the last minute. My personal view is that this was really an exemplary project of how standards in buildingSMART should be delivered. It was really a community effort. We had hundreds of people involved. I think what, from my perspective, is that we had a dozen software tools already implementing IDS before we had a formal release. So releasing a standard officially and already having it available in software tools, I think is the way to go. We did this for Documents API, we did it for IDS. I think this is really the way we should be developing standards, checking them and testing them already before publishing them. That's what I was so excited about this project. That's also the reason why it took 3 years. We could have created a standard and dumped it onto the industry and then got a lot of complaints. But we really took the time to develop this together with the software vendors into something that is very reliable and works very consistently in the same way. That really makes me proud. And I think this is a good example of how the next versions of IFC should also be developed.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just highlight one other comment from Sean from Trimble. What education for clients? What of an education for clients to actually use IDS, and what is available in the funnel? And I think maybe one thing we mentioned is that, or we haven't mentioned, is that we have this accelerator program, which is a way of the industry supporting clients and organizations that want to develop things like an IDS. We're actually working with Sonnenbelt and the Fehmarn project, this large project connecting Denmark and Germany, with the Danish chapter, and we're actually helping to develop their IDS with the client. So we're seeing more uptake and more need for sort of hand-on support for that, and that's why we developed this accelerator program to support clients as well. Thanks for the question, Sean. All right, well, with that, we're actually out of time, so would like to thank Leon very much for your presentation. It was very, very interesting. Thank you to the attendees very much for your interest, and couple of questions. We'll make the slides available, assuming that's okay, Leon, to send around the slides afterwards. And of course, the recording as well. So we'll give you access to the recording so you can rewatch this. We'll also try to follow up some of these questions offline because there's some quite specific ones here that we'll try to help with. But with that, I'd like to say thank you all very much for your attendance, and we look forward to welcoming you to a future Building Smart webinar. Thank you.